Good morning, Mr. Little. Perhaps I should explain to you that we have a break at 11:30. We sit till 1 o'clock when we stop for lunch till 2, and then we sit between 2 and 4:15. We have a 15-minute break at 3 o'clock. I understand that you may need additional breaks. If you do, please just say so, and we can have a break at any time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Would you raise your right hand and say the words of the oath, please? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Graham.
Good morning.
Morning.
You are William Little,
That's correct.
and we may have heard people refer to you as Billy Little.
That's yes.
What age are you?
I'm 64.
And you are a senior investigator with PIRC, and you have been since, you've worked with them since March of 2013.
I retired on the 29th of December.
I was going to ask you when you'd retired, so 29th December, so you're retired now.
Yeah, yes.
But in March 2013, you joined the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner,
I did.
and that's the month prior to PIRC officially coming into existence.
That's correct.
In May 2015, you were a Deputy Senior Investigator,
I was.
and that was the same as Mr. Keith Harrower we've heard from.
That's correct.
And you then became a Senior Investigator from the 1st of March 2018.
That's correct.
And again, that was the same date as Keith Harrower became a Senior Investigator.
It was, yes.
You had previous experience of being in Strathclyde Police.
I was.
You'd joined them in 1980 and had 29 years service.
That's correct.
And you retired from the police in April 2009.
I did.
And then I understand you went to work in Jersey for a while with the state police there.
I did, yes.
And you were helping to investigate unsolved crimes, including homicides.
That's correct, yes.
And you did that for a year or so, and then in March 2013, as we said, you joined PIRC.
I did.
Now, I don't know if you've watched any of the other evidence we've heard in this inquiry, Mr. Little.
I have seen some, yes.
You've probably seen me refer to a blue folder,
Yeah.
which witnesses have in front of them when they give evidence. That is, would you open that up, please? And you'll see that there are a number of documents in that folder. Now, just to explain to you, as I go through and ask questions today, I will ask for documents to be brought up on the screen. And that's so everyone can see what I'm referring to. But we've provided you with some hard copies of certain documents that I'm likely to refer to. And if you wish to refer to them at any stage, please do so. Those are for your use. And as I'm going through different questions today, if you think, oh, there's something in my statement or there's something in a book, please feel free to find it, and we can see if we can put it up on the screen as well.
Thank you.
If we have on occasions sometimes not been able to locate a document that a witness wants to refer to, and when that happens, I'll say we'll try and get it over a break, or we can get it for next Tuesday.
Okay, thank you.
Let's look at the first document, which is a PIRC statement dated the 28th of July 2015, and it's PIRC 00370. You see that on the screen?
I do, yes.
And that's got your name at the top. It's written self-prepared, so you prepared this yourself at some point, and it's dated the 28th of July 2015, and at that time you were a Deputy Senior Investigator.
Yes.
And you should have a hard copy of that in your blue folder.
Okay.
Now, I think in your first inquiry statement, which we'll come to in a moment, you told us that you began drafting this statement that we see on the screen about 12 weeks after the events recorded within it.
Yeah, that's correct.
And when you prepared this statement, you were in the PIRC offices and you had access to your notebook or notebooks, and daybooks and information recorded in Clue 2.
That's correct.
And am I right in saying Clue 2 is a management system that PIRC officers, investigators have available to them?
It is, yes.
And I think in your first inquiry statement you say you did your best to be truthful and accurate in what you said in the statement we see on the screen.
That's correct.
And I think you also say if there is a discrepancy between your inquiry statements and this PIRC statement from 2015, that the chair should prefer your PIRC statement as this was written at the time.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. Let's look at your first inquiry statement, please, which is SBPI 00255. And we see this was taken on the 4th of November and the 20th of December 2022. And if we can look at the final page, it's 45 pages long. And if we look at the final page, we'll see your signature. Well, your signature has been redacted for the purposes of the screen. But I think on your hard copy, you'll see your signature.
That's correct, yes, I do.
And you've signed every page.
I have, yes.
And that was on,
Excuse me.
no, not at all, the 1st of February 2023.
Sorry, yes, I think. Yes, that's correct.
And the final paragraph that we can also see on the screen is 85, and it says, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And you understood that to be the case when you signed this statement.
I did, yes.
Thank you. Can we now look at your second inquiry statement, which is SBPI 00421. Now, I'm calling this your second statement, but actually it was a request in writing from the inquiry, which we call a Rule 8 request, and you responded to those questions in writing.
I did, yes.
So the heading is Statement in Response to Rule 8 Request. I'm going to, for convenience, call this your second inquiry statement.
Yeah, that's right.
This is 151 pages long, and I wonder if we can look at the final page, and we see that this was again signed by you on every page.
Yes.
And that was on the 3rd of December last year. And the final paragraph, if we could look at that, is 376. If we could move up the screen, please. That's it. And the response to that question is, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And again, you knew that to be the case when you signed.
I did, yes.
Well, we've heard that PIRC came into existence on the 1st of April 2013, and I'd like to ask just some big preliminary questions about the training that you'd had at that, round about that time. Can we look at your, this is your second inquiry statement, look at paragraph 6 of this. And I think in this paragraph you've set out details of some of the training courses that you've been on or you were on when you were part of PIRC.
That's correct, yes.
And you've given us a list for each year. There it is. And you say, when I joined PIRC, I had previously been employed for 29 years as a police officer. In my earlier statement to the public inquiry, I outlined the roles I performed and the experience I gained. That's available for the chair. This was principally as an investigator, which was laterally as a senior investigating officer or deputy senior investigating officer in major complex investigations. Upon retirement, I also worked in the role as a civilian senior investigating officer for the States of Jersey Police, and you took charge of teams. You've talked about that already. And if we move down, You see, I did undertake different training throughout my PIRC career, which is documented within PIRC training records. And you start with 2013 to 2014. So 2013 you started with PIRC. Do those dates run from a particular month in 2013? Or did they start from March when you began with PIRC? Or is it January to December? So we're looking at 2013 to 2014.
I'm unsure of that, Ms Graham, as I lifted that from a spreadsheet that is held within PIRC records.
Right.
And I couldn't say whether it ran from March to March or it ran from January to December.
Well, that's...
I'd imagine it maybe be January to December if it's lifted off a spreadsheet, but
Right.
I couldn't clarify that, at this time.
All right, thank you. We see that you attended a number of courses in that first year that you were with PIRC.
Yep.
And I'm interested in the training re fatal accident inquiries and deaths investigations in Scotland.
Yep.
Tell us what that training was for.
My recollection was that that was an in-house training delivered by a member of staff who had moved to PIRC from the Crown Office Deaths Unit, if my memory serves me right, in respect of that training. So it was basically given an overview of the role of the Deaths Unit, or Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit it became known as, and the link into fatal accident inquiries.
Was it primarily about fatal accident inquiries rather than training into investigations?
Well, it included deaths investigation, because there's obviously an investigation conducted that may end up at a fatal accident inquiry.
How long did that training last?
I think that was a day's training.
And in what respect, do you remember much about the content about deaths investigations?
No, after this passage of time, no, I don't know.
Then can we move on to 2014 to 2015?
Yep.
And I appreciate that may cover the period up to March 2015, or it may cover the period from January 2014 to December 2015. I'm interested in the reference to post-incident manager awareness. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, that's... now, I can't recall if that was in-house training or was attendance at the police training centre. I know I certainly attended a course at the police training course. It wasn't the full post-incident manager course, but it was attended part of it in respect of awareness in the role of the PIM and the part that PIRC would play if there was a PIP held.
Right. We've heard from Mr. Harrower that he described himself as PIM aware.
Yep.
But this wasn't a course that allowed you to become a PIM.
No, it wasn't the full
post-incident
PIM
manager.
course. I'm not a trained PIM.
Right. Thank you. It also mentions there training inequalities.
Yes,
What
correct,
did
yeah.
that involve?
My recollection is that this was a training course delivered by, I think it was one of the universities or people from a university, and it was a course in respect of equality and diversity.
Can you remember anything about the content?
I'm sorry, I can't remember anything in the no, I can't remember anything so much about the content. I do remember it was I believe it was an external delivered course. It wasn't an in-house course, and it was everybody in my understanding, as in recollection, is that everybody in PIRC attended that, not just the investigations department, but the whole of PIRC attended this.
Was it also a full day? Or
Oh,
was it
yeah,
longer?
yeah. I actually think it was more than a day. I think it was maybe 2 days.
2 days. And did you? What did you learn from that course?
It was obviously, I'd like to think it increased my awareness in respect of, matters concerning equality and diversity, and it made you think of your own actions, and maybe, and not maybe, you did think of your own actions and increase your awareness. It certainly made me think more about my use of language, and by that I mean I had I was maybe addressing it, or doing a briefing or whatever. I knew I had a habit of saying "ladies and gentlemen" before I would start the briefing. I remember thinking, well, that's maybe not appropriate to everybody and everybody's viewpoint, and changing a term I use is "folks," "dear all," and also thinking, just about yourself and how you might approach things, and ensuring that you take awareness when you're dealing with any particular minority groups and over and above everybody else, in your use of language. I think that was the biggest point that I took from that.
We've heard some witnesses give evidence about unconscious bias.
Yep.
And training in that, about raising awareness about bias. Was that something that was included in that
Yeah, it was,
course?
absolutely. Yeah. And I have to say, it made me realise that we all have bias in some way, but we maybe don't realise we have that bias, and it's about kind of inward reflection on that, and yes, and being mindful of that, and I said in particular in your use of language.
And did you exercise that mindful reflection, inner reflection?
I think I did,
in your
yes.
practice?
I think I did, yes. Yeah.
And in relation to the final entry there, PIM exercise with Police Scotland, what
Yep.
was that?
Yeah, there was an exercise held by Police Scotland, and it was held in Aberdeen. I remember we were up for a couple of days. We were asked to participate, and it was there was a PIP exercise there and a PIM exercise. It was a whole post-incident process, and it was a mixture of scenario based, that the police had fatally shot somebody, and there was then put in place the post-incident procedure. My recollection is that there was 4 of us attended, myself, Keith Harrower, Brian Dodd and Richard Casey. And I was selected along with one other, and I can't remember if it was who else the second person was, but we were actually participants in the incident, and the other 2 representatives, they were observers. And it took you through the incident that occurred, and it wasn't just classroom based. We were actually out at a scene, and the firearms team were there, and they went through a firearm scenario, and they discharged, lethally discharged the weapon, and then ended up back in the PIM suite in Aberdeen, and it took us through the whole gambit of what would happen in that incident. And my part was to be that I was the attending PIRC person. What would I expect before I got there, and what would I expect to happen when I was there, and what part I would play in that, and my dealings with the post-incident manager.
And how do you feel that course equipped you for dealing with a situation where there was a post-incident procedure in place?
Well, prior to that, and although I'd been in that post-incident manager awareness course, I believe I was there before that, is I'd never been a PIP. I'd never taken part in a PIP. PIP was originally, I think the chair's aware, PIP was initially a firearms process, and was only instigated in the course of a firearms incident, particularly a lethal firearms incident. So that gave me a great awareness there of what to expect, and my engagement with that as a PIP, as a police process, and I thought it was very good of Police Scotland inviting us into that process as part of the training. Yeah, and I felt it was very beneficial.
And was it your understanding that PIP at that time was only brought in if there'd been some sort of firearm incident?
That's correct.
And what did a firearm mean to you?
A firearm meant to me is in relation to the PIP process, a firearm meant to be a conventional firearm. Everything they talked about was a conventional firearm, a lethal barreled weapon, for want of a better explanation.
Was
But
there
under
any-
legislation, a firearm means different things as well. It does include taser and it does include CS and now Pava spray.
And so, in terms of your understanding at the time, did you come away from that course thinking PIPs were in place for guns?
Yes.
As a PIRC investigator, what training had you been given before the 3rd of May 2015 in relation to carrying out investigations for PIRC?
Well, apart from obviously what's kind of highlighted there and listen to the courses, the training that we did do as the month before we went live, or the time I was there from the 1st of March to the 1st of April 2013, is we engaged in a series of awareness in respect of our role, the legislation we would be working under, and how we would implement that, and how we would engage with the policing bodies that we deal with. As you know, we deal with all policing bodies and HMRC in Scotland. So it was more about heightened awareness. It was being aware of the other members of PIRC, what their skill set was, because there was a variety of skill sets brought together, and how you would utilise these skill sets within any investigation. So it was more just about internal awareness, and we conducted some role play if there was an incident, and and that included death, included road deaths, included shootings. The sort of what I would describe as the major incidents that we deal with. So it was all just in-house training. It wasn't like a dedicated training course we went on to.
Did it include deaths in police custody or deaths after contact with the police?
Well, it did include, deaths. It included both. If we, majority of people think a death in custody is a death occurring in a custody suite. But it was that awareness that it doesn't just include that. It's death if the police officers have arrested somebody outside. So.
You've said that was in-house. Who delivered that training?
That training, it was a mixture of basically the senior managers who we had at that time, and as I said, it was local awareness, and we role played the part of being an investigator, a lead investigator into these incidents.
Did any of that training that you had on investigations involve issues where race or racial discrimination was a factor to be considered?
Not that I recall, no.
Were you given training in Article 2 and compliance with Article 2 in investigations?
Well, there was an awareness around, obviously, that the Human Rights Act kind of underpins everything that we do, so yes.
Can I show you a couple of three documents and see if you recognise them? One is PIRC 04446. And this is a document which was dated November 2012, but I understand we'll hear evidence that it was dealt with in the lead up to PIRC coming into existence and after. And it's called Police Investigations and Review Commissioner Operational Model Response to Article 2 Investigations. Do you recognise that? And maybe we can move down the screen.
Could you scroll up a wee bit, please?
Yes.
So it's just obviously the title there. Yes, I do recall that.
If we move down slightly. Do you see that in the page there, it talks about the Human Rights Act and obligations imposed under Article 2, applying to PIRC, and sets out 5 procedural obligations. Independence, the investigation must be effective, reasonably prompt, there must be a sufficient element of public scrutiny, and the next of kin must be involved to an appropriate extent. Do you recognise that?
I do, yes.
We can scroll through the document if
No,
you want to.
No, I do,
Yeah.
yeah.
Was that something you were trained in, that document and the implications of Article 2?
I don't specifically remember a training course or day on this particular document. It formed part of the discussion we had, and the document was available. Yeah.
Is it something you've read? Or at that time had you read it?
I believe I would have. I can't specifically call sitting down the day I read it, but my viewpoint is I would have read that.
Right.
Yeah.
And can we look at a memorandum, PIRC 04453? This is entitled Memorandum of Understanding between the Crown Office and PIRC.
Yep.
Do you recognise that document?
I do.
And was that something you were familiar with?
Yes.
And did you receive training on this?
Again, it formed the same part. I wouldn't. It'd be incorporated into training and specifically sitting for a morning or whatever. Going through this.
And as we could scroll through this, we see that it sets out the role of PIRC, statutory responsibilities of PIRC, and the liaison with the Crown Office, that type of thing.
Yes.
Thank you. Can put that to one side. And then if we can look at PIRC 04438, this is another document we've heard about. PIRC independent investigative processes following police use of firearms. And if we move down, it sets out investigative function, and again there's references to Article 2 and reference to firearms, and I think you mentioned this a moment ago, a firearm can be a taser or CS gas.
Yes.
Do you recognise that document?
Could you scroll back to the top of it, please?
Yes.
I do have some recollection of that, and my recollection's based round about the findings following the Mark Duggan incident down in the Metropolitan Police in response to how we would respond to an incident to ensure we responded appropriately, I think is the content of that document.
And do you remember having sight of this at the time?
Yes, I'm going to say I would have. I don't specifically remember kind of reading that, but the circumstances I do. I think I might be wrong there, but I think this maybe sets out how PIRC would respond to a fatal shooting to ensure that we took cognizance of the, as it says there, the findings of the inquiry into Mark Duggan.
Again, do you think this is primarily in relation to firearms?
Yes.
Or do you think it's primarily in relation to a shooting?
Well, it says following police use of firearms.
And if we move down that page, you remember a moment ago I said it also includes tasers and
Yes.
gas, the use of discharge of CS gas.
Yes.
Can you tell us what your recollection is? Did you think this related more to sort of shootings rather than tasers or gas?
I'm going to say shootings, and I base that on the fact of, as my awareness is, I don't think there's ever been a PIP instigated that I'm aware of in Scotland in respect of a discharge of CS or PAVA, solely PIP because of that incident. So my recollection is this would be more for a discharge or the presentation of a conventional firearm, because I'm not aware that there's ever been a PIP called, and bearing in mind as the police that decide if a PIP takes place for a taser or a discharge of either CS or PAVA gas.
So on the 3rd of May 2015,
Yep.
where there had been no guns or
Yep. Yes.
shooting, but there had been discharge of CS gas. Did you consider at that time that this document had any applicability, or did you not think it was applicable?
Well, I think it's applicable in respect of, my recollection is that this document sets out how PIRC would respond. So it is applicable. Yes, it is applicable, because this, because it clearly says there that the use of firearms design. Yep. And as I said earlier, a firearm does include a CS or PAVA spray.
Did you have regard to the guidance in this document when you were involved in the investigation into Mr. Bio's death?
I don't recall that, no.
You don't recall having regard to it, or you don't think you had regard to it?
I don't recall having regard specifically to that document, but no, I don't regard having.
And the last page of this document, there's a section about minimum deployment of PIRC personnel.
Yep.
Do you remember having regard to that information?
Yeah, I can recall this document, and I can recall the time when. I couldn't tell you exactly when it came into being. You may be able to assist me there, but
We've been advised it came into existence on the 17th of June 2014.
Thank you. This is a minimum deployment. And this was a point I said earlier, that I believe this document outlines what we would consider as minimal deployment. I have an issue with that minimal deployment, because that minimal deployment gives us a senior investigator, a scribe, a scene manager, 2 productioners, 1 to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people. Now, at that time, PIRC had 6 investigation teams of 3 people. They had 18 people, yeah, and 2 senior investigators, so it'd take up to 20. So that's asking for almost 50% of your available resources to attend that incident. Now, in my experience, the majority of critical, if I could say, critical incidents involving the police use of firearms, is that doesn't happen on a Monday, Friday between 8 to 4. It happens out of hours. And out of hours, at that time, we had an on-call team of 1 team leader, a DSI, and 2 investigators. So how was 1 team leader and 2 investigators meant to fulfil that minimum deployment? I remember discussing this, and the answer is, well, you'll phone round. Now, having many times been at an out-of-hours incident and been in charge of an out-of-hour incident, just phoning everybody around in the hope you can get somebody is a bit ad hoc, because people are not just sitting by the phone. Some will be away. Some will be out at a restaurant and they've had alcohol, so they're not able to attend. So I think that's, and I've always thought that's utopia. But how do you muster 50% of your establishment at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning? I've always had an issue with that, and I still do have.
Thank you. When you said you'd discuss this, who did you discuss it
I remember raising it at the time. I remember we did a tabletop exercise, and I raised it at the time within the organisation.
with? When was this tabletop exercise?
We were live, we were started, and it was a day we did a tabletop exercise. It might have been after this document came out, but we did a tabletop exercise within the organisation. Again, the tabletop exercise was a day, Monday to Friday, during the day, so everybody's there. And my argument has been, well, where do we get that at 4 o'clock in the morning? How do I get that at 4 o'clock in the morning?
And who did you direct your comments to?
Just generally within, and we were all there. The senior managers were there. John Mitchell was there, and Irene Scullion was there. But I've always had I see a challenge with that, getting that minimum deployment out. I would love to have that an instant. I would love to have that if I went to a PIP or a scene. I would love to have that. And what happens if you have more than one scene, which we've had several times? You know?
In terms of your understanding of this minimum deployment, if there's 2 separate scenes, would you expect the same number to attend each scene?
Well, that's what they're saying for a scene. So this is again, it's guidance. You know, this is saying that. So we include that. So we've gone from 9 to 14, and we've got establishment of 18. I don't know how we would do that.
Are you aware of that utopia ever having been achieved in relation to any minimum deployment?
I wasn't involved in the incident, but the incident recently at the hotel in Glasgow. But that happened, I can't remember the day, but it was a Monday to Friday, and it was during the day when the police fatally shot somebody. Yes, so every PIRC resource we had went to that.
Was anything done about your concerns? Were they addressed in any way?
No, because we still had the challenge of you just phone everybody around. We had a list of phone numbers. You carried. I would suggest. Well, I certainly carried it. I would suggest that every team leader carried a list of the phone numbers, which included their personal numbers, their home number, and their PIRC mobile number. But just because you have the phone number doesn't, you know.
Thank you. The other thing, if we can leave that document to one side, I noticed in your inquiry statement, so back at SPPI 00421, paragraph 6, you said that you've, prior to retirement, you were on an equality, diversity and inclusion course delivered by ACAS.
Yes.
I'm interested in that course. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. My recollection of that course is that was in relation to conducting job interviews and how you ensure that you take cognizance of equality, diversity and inclusion if you're interviewing people for a position within PIRC.
I've asked other witnesses about diversity in PIRC.
Yes.
In May 2015, can you tell us anything about the diversity in terms of the staff numbers that you had?
Within the investigations department, as my recollection at that time, we had, I think we had, it was either 22 or 24, including the seniors and not including Mr Mitchell and Scullion in respect of that. So there was a balance of males and females within that group.
Do you remember how many women there were?
Off the top of my head, no. But there was a number. It wasn't as if there was just one or two.
Were there any ethnic minorities employed by PIRC at that time?
Not in the investigations department. My recollection I couldn't say with any certainty in relation to the other parts of the organisation.
We've heard that quite a large number of staff in the investigations department were former police officers.
There was a number, yes.
Do you remember how many weren't former police officers?
The exact number, no, but at that time we certainly had people who had came to us from the Forces Investigation Department, from the Border Agency, from Trade and Standards, from the Fire and Rescue Service investigations. So there was 4 areas that I can definitely recall that they were there from, and at that time, the 3rd of May, we also had 2 members of staff who had just started a trainee development scheme being started within the investigations department. So they came again from not the police officers. They came from I had one of the trainees in my team. He came from the care. He worked in the care sector. Yeah.
So definitely 6 investigators or trainee investigators who were not former police officers.
I'm saying more than 6. Could be certainly 2 fire and service investigators.
So
Was this-
definitely 7.
Yes.
Can I ask you, before I move on to the events in 2015, can I ask you about an incident that took place at Victoria Hospital on the 18th of October 2014? I think you mentioned this in your first inquiry statement, SPPI 00255 at paragraph 8. And you say in October 2014
Yep.
you had undertaken an investigation in relation to an incident at Kirkcaldy Hospital where police officers had discharged CS spray within the A&E unit, and the whole unit had to be shut down because of the use of spray, and the matter was reported to PIRC, as all incidences of the use of firearms, including spray, must be reported to PIRC. My recollections are that none of the officers who were involved in that incident were involved in the incident with Mr. Bio. And then you also mention it in your second inquiry statement at paragraph 38. This is 421. I'm sorry, we won't be able to show both of these paragraphs
That's okay.
together.
I've opened up the
Thank
the
you.
relate one. Yes, thank you.
And so 38, and you say largely the same, and you say there was nothing for a PIRC scene manager to examine because it was a use of spray which would dissipate in the air, I imagine. You wrote undertook that investigation.
yes, I did.
Did you write a report
I
on
did,
that?
yes.
And did you make recommendations to Police Scotland about this incident?
My recollection is, I did, yes, I did, yeah.
And do you remember what it was you recommended?
I can't remember how many recommend. I think there was maybe 2, but it was definitely the challenge during the course of that investigation. One of the challenges that I recall was the record creeping within that division, and that is that's I call it the 5th division. I can't remember the number they used for it. It was almost non-existent, and the recommendation was we recommended that they need to get their house in order, for want of a better expression, in respect of recording of the spray, and that's about recording how much spray is used, when it's used, the weight of the canisters. Is that some after there's been a discharge of spray, the canisters weighed, and that gives an indication of against the records of how much contaminant was used. I can't remember what the other recommendation was. I remember there was an issue around about CCTV, but we don't have the power to make a recommendation to the NHS. That's not within our grasp.
But it was police officers who'd used the spray
It
in
was,
the hospital.
yes.
Now, I'm interested in, you've said there was issues with the recording of how much spray had been used.
Yes.
The weight of the canister before it had been used, the weight after the canister had been used,
Yes.
and an absence of records. Why would that type of thing be helpful to an investigation? Knowing how much weight.
Well, first of all, it's helpful. It's helpful to know as who's that canister assigned to. And that's part of the record keeping. Who's that's assigned to. It's also about where the CS spray, or it was CS spray at that time. CS spray is stored, and what locker that's stored. It's also keeping a note of the use of the spray, and as I said, the amount of spray used. And if they don't weigh the spray when they come back to identify that, they could be going out in their next deployment with a CS canister that has no CS in it, which would obviously could have a detrimental effect if they go to use it at that point of view. So for that's point of use. And this is, my recollection is that these are all areas that Police Scotland undertook and how they managed CS spray, bearing in mind, as a firearm.
I suppose, would it also be possible if you know the weight when the person is allocated the spray,
Yes.
and if, for example, they said, I didn't use my spray, but the weight has dropped,
Yes.
you would be able to see that that had been
That's
discharged.
correct. Yeah, and vice versa, if they said they just used it for a second, but actually the whole container is empty, then that's an indication. If that's the only time that spray has been used, then it's not been used for a second. It's been used for a lot more than a second.
Right. So it would allow some analysis to be done in terms
That's
of the
correct.
discharge by an investigator.
Yes.
And I think you do mention also in the second inquiry statement we've got on the screen at paragraph 182, you say PIRC had issued 2 recommendations to
Was it
Police
2?
Scotland. That's 182. There we are. You see in the middle of that paragraph, PIRC had issued 2 recommendations to Police Scotland on the completion of the investigation into that incident, and those were issued on the 19th of March 2015. Was that your recommendations to Police Scotland?
That would, but yeah, the report would have gone to Police Scotland. There was a police referral, as we describe it. Yeah.
It then says Police Scotland advised PIRC that they had implemented both of my recommendations on the 10th of November 2015 after the death of Sheku Bayo.
Yep.
I'm interested in the period of time that it took from your report to the date of implementation, or at least when you were advised about implementation. What powers did PIRC have at that time in terms of placing deadlines or time limits on recommendations?
I think the timeline we gave them, I'm unsure if it's still the same. It was 3 months. We expected some response within 3 months. In respect of that, we have no powers to force a policing body to implement what we recommend. Although I'm not aware of any policing body not implementing a recommendation or not taking action on a recommendation. We maintain a recommendations monitor, and that is once the report goes in and the recommendations, that is updated by our administration staff, and they would do follow-ups if they hadn't seen any. They would I'll use the phrase a jag letter. They would send a letter to them saying we provided this to you. We're now past the 3 months. What's happening with this? Yeah.
Looking to the future, I appreciate you've retired now, but you did do this report. Would additional powers be of assistance to PIRC in reinforcing the recommendations that are made in these reports?
I think so, yes. Yes, as I say, I'm not aware of there being any issue from a policing body not implementing a recommendation. I would envisage, although I've not been involved in it, that there's been previous ones where there's been some discussion because it can be challenging. You know, and an example I would give would be it would be ideal if every police officer carried CCTV, yep, or carried a camera. But we know that there's challenges round about, and it's financial challenges. So, you know, we couldn't put in a report. We recommend that every every police officer be issued with a body cam, because we know they can't do that, right? So we need to be, you know, there's got to be, there's thought put into recommendation, justification, put into that. But yes, I do think that and you can see in that one there is that these recommendations have been implemented after we've started the investigation into the death of Mr. Bayou. And the challenges around about CS spray were still there when we were doing that investigation. So yes, if we'd had some power, yes, I think it would be beneficial.
If we have other statements and information evidence available to the chair that indicates that it was very difficult for PIRC to determine the weight of the canisters,
Yes.
and assess to what extent they had been discharged on
Absolutely.
the day of the 3rd
Yes.
of May. Can you explain just in summary what the difficulties were for PIRC?
They were very similar to what the matters I'd identified in the investigation into the incident at the Victoria Hospital. Is the challenge was identifying what canister was assigned to what officer. And this was also a phase when Police Scotland were changing from CS to PAVA, so you had both CS and PAVA sprays. Both CS and PAVA were deployed that day. The manner in which, and I'm generalising here because I can't recall if all the canisters were taken when the equipment was taken off the officers under a forensic kind of strategy. But there was other equipment was lying about the scene. It was just ingathered and not taken forensically, as I would describe it. But you also had the challenges, how much CS and how much PAVA was actually discharged by the officers at Mr. Bayou. And obviously, compounding that challenge was that information was the decision taken by the attending officers not to provide statements. So who actually discharged the PAVA against who discharged the CS spray on that day, I was not aware of for some time. And how much was used. And one of the areas that we kind of that was at the back of my mind was, has the combination of CS and PAVA being used against Mr. Bayou caused some sort of chemical reaction within Mr. Bayou, and that was an area that we looked at. So really, the poor record keeping, the poor management of the issuing of the canisters, and thereafter the use of it and the weighing of it and the recording of it, yes, that caused challenges. And if that recommendation had been issued prior to this incident, then some of these issues would have been mitigated and we would have been able to identify. But we'll go back, as the instant I submitted the report on the 19th of March, we give a 3-month period, and that would have taken us beyond when this incident occurred.
It would have taken you to around the 19th of June.
Yes, yeah.
Am I right in thinking, from what you've said, that if there had been proper records, even though you didn't have statements from the officers at that time,
Yes.
that it would have been possible for PIRC to identify everyone's spray, weigh that spray, and identify if any had been discharged during the course of that incident?
Yes, we would have, yes. Yeah.
And to what extent it had been
Yes,
discharged?
and how much had been sprayed, yes.
So regardless of whether you had a statement from any of the officers,
Yeah.
that information would have allowed you to make that assessment?
Yeah, but the challenge being is I didn't have a statement from the officer, so I didn't know who'd used what spray and in what manner, and their rationale for using it.
And you didn't have the records?
No.
Thank you. Now, we've heard evidence this week from Keith Harrower, who spoke about the 3rd of May 2015. My understanding is you weren't in the office
No.
that day at all.
No.
So you weren't present. But am I correct to say that you came into the office and commenced duty at about 7:30 on Monday the 4th of May, And that's when your involvement began.
That's correct, yes.
Right. And I think you mentioned that at SPPI 00255, paragraph 36.
Oh, sorry, different statement.
There we are, that's on the screen. This is your first inquiry
Thank you.
statement. And you say there you came in on the 4th of May and you went to Hamilton. You'd been on holiday before the holiday weekend. Am I right in thinking the Monday was a holiday Monday?
It was, yeah. It was one of the May weekends. Yeah. Actually, I think the reflection is I actually hadn't been on holiday just prior to that weekend. I think I'd been on holiday the week before and I'd been back for a number of days, and then it was a holiday weekend again.
Right. You, from what you say there, I was oblivious to the incident.
Yes.
I do constantly read the news, but I hadn't, for whatever reason, prior to coming in. That was coming in on the Monday morning.
That's correct, yes.
And then you remember thinking, what's happening? There was lots of people activity. Something must have happened. And then you were given a briefing by Irene Scullion and Keith Harrower on the circumstances surrounding the death of Sheku Bayo. And you were asked if you remembered the details of that briefing, and your recollection was that Keith prepared the briefing paper. And you talk about normally you'd prepare a briefing paper for an out-of-hours incident for the managers in the morning, and you had sight of a briefing paper. Keith Harrower was the author, and it was dated the 3rd of May 2015. And I wonder if we could look at that, please, the briefing paper. PIRC 03694. And I think you said in that statement you had access to this briefing paper. It's headed up Briefing Note for Director of Investigations.
Yes.
We've heard that's John Mitchell.
He was, yes.
And it was dated the 3rd of May 2015. And
Yes.
Keith Harrower gave evidence this week to say he'd prepared that briefing paper, briefing note. Can we just check, that's the document that you're referring to when you refer in your statement to the briefing paper, is it?
Yes.
Do you recognise that?
I do, yes.
We'll come back to that in some detail in a moment. Can I, first of all, just in relation to your general impressions of the office that day, you've talked about activity and it being busy, you realised something had happened. How many investigators were in the office that day?
Exact number?
No,
Sorry, I couldn't tell you an exact number.
Right.
I don't know if there was MD on holiday, Reading. But what I would say is that the number that were there, they were all utilised apart from one on that day in response to this incident.
Right. Who was the one?
Richard Casey.
We've heard he was a senior investigator.
He was, or he is.
Oh, sorry, he is. And what was he doing that day?
My understanding that he was being left to respond to any other incident that might come in. Obviously there'll still be more incidents coming in, more referrals coming in, and they would need somebody to manage that aspect.
In 2015, do you remember how many referrals you would get on average every week or every day?
No, not nearly as many as we get just now, from that point of view. How many? I would take to guess. Some weeks it could be 2, some weeks it could be 5, 6, 7, you know. Yeah, so, because bear in mind, they're coming in from all policing, and it's not just from Crown, which, you know, be the kind of criminal aspects or the kind of the death aspects. You know, it's the police make referrals and all policing bodies make referrals. But the number, no, I couldn't hazard a guess. That would be recorded somewhere. There would be.
All right.
some statistic of what came in what month.
Okay.
Bearing in mind that we don't take every police referral that comes in. We have the ability to say, no, we're content with what's happened there.
All right, thank you. Can I go back briefly to your first inquiry statement, the
Yeah.
2551, and look at paragraph 27. You were asked here about how important it was for the information provided by the police to be accurate in the initial hour or two of a PIRC investigation, and how much this impacts the decision making that follows. And you say here it has a lot of importance, as that's what you're basing your decisions on. So it needs to be accurate. And you talk about things that you ask for at an early stage.
Yep.
We've heard about things called storm records,
Yes.
which are records about calls that may have come in, actions that have been taken. And then towards the end of that paragraph, you say, so I can say of information it can only be as accurate as what they know at that time. And in this instance, I can only base my decisions on the accuracy of that information that I'm getting. So we've heard that additional information can be brought in as the investigation progresses.
Yes.
And you've said here, you can only base your decisions on the accuracy of the information you're getting. Do you proceed on the basis, do you take the information at face value and proceed on that basis initially until it changes?
Well, you do take it at face value, yes, because that's what all you've got to work on. So that's the same with any incident, and then as the investigation progresses, you may identify that some of that information is inaccurate.
Can we look back at the briefing note, PIRC 03694? And, sorry, go back to paragraph 36, we see you've referred to it. And, sorry, in your statement you refer to the briefing note. And you say that the briefing was from, I'm happy to go back to the briefing note, sorry. You say it was from Irene Scullion and Keith Harrower. Were you given a copy of the briefing note?
I don't know if I received this when I initially was asked to undertake or be involved in this investigation. This note certainly, I can't recall when I first saw this note on the 3rd of May. I think when I first went in, I'd hardly even got my jacket off, and I was called in to see Irene and Keith was there, and I'm unsure if John Mitchell was there at the time as well. And I was given, I think initially I was given a verbal briefing, as my recollection, and then I later became aware of the briefing note from that, because my recollection is I hadn't even powered up my laptop or computer or anything. I'd just come in, take my coat off, and I was called in to say, you're undertaking this investigation. The words that I used at the time was, you'll be the lead investigation, and John McSporn, who wasn't in that day, will provide oversight. That quickly changed, you may ask me about that later on, that quickly changed. So right away, I'm being told, you're taking this on. I was given a briefing. The exact content of the briefing I can't recall now, but it made me realise that this was right away was a significant investigation for us, and I wanted to put in place some form of structure and get this up. I would describe it as up and running. You'd obviously had Keith did what he did with the on-call team and some additional people, but now we needed to get some structure put in place. And roles allocated to specific people to take this investigation forward, and we need to do that quickly. So that I don't recall reading that right away. This may have well been after there was a general briefing to everybody, again delivered in the main by Keith, because he'd been on site, that I maybe had a read at this after that, but I certainly saw it in the early part of that day.
You said you were called in. Was it Irene Scullion that called you in and appointed you as lead investigator?
I think it was Irene and John. I remember John Mitchell saying about, you know, like,
We may hear from John later in the hearing that he wasn't in that day. He wasn't in until later.
oh, right.
But that's your recollection anyway, at the moment.
My recollection is John was there that day.
Well, we've not heard his evidence,
Right, okay.
so I may be wrong on that.
I may be mistaken, but definitely Irene Scullion was there, and Keith and Richard Casey.
A senior manager appointed you as lead
yes,
investigator.
yes.
And you were given a verbal briefing. Was that by Keith Harrower?
Yes, it would have been.
We've heard evidence from Mr. Harrower that he had his operational notes available, he had his briefing
Yep.
note available, his memory of events. Do you remember anything about that verbal briefing that you were given?
No. After this passage of time, no.
And you've said you became aware of this briefing note later. Do you remember when you became aware of it?
It would have been very early on. It would have been very, very, very early on.
Right. In the morning?
Yes, in the morning, sorry.
Would that be shortly after you came in, shortly after the briefing, or at a later point?
I think it'd be shortly after. My recollection is it's shortly after the briefing. Yeah. And my recollection is the information that I was passed verbally was what's in this paper.
Did you take any notes of that initial briefing from Mr. Harrower?
I can't recall, but you know, I would need to see what I would call my daybook from that day.
We have, I think, 2 hard copies of a notebook, as I understand it. One may be a daybook in your blue
Okay,
folder.
thank you.
One's definitely a notebook, official notebook covering that period, PIRC 04200. I won't ask for that to be put on the screen at the moment, unless you say there's something in there about that briefing.
Sorry, is that PIRC 0? Oh no, I'm talking about my daybook, the kind of the bigger
And the other
book.
one is, again, I won't have this put on the screen, PIRC 04520. So it should be 2 quite chunky documents. One says book at the top. Office
Yeah,
depot.
yeah,
Is that the daybook?
That's the daybook, yeah. Just give me a wee second.
Well, let's get that on the screen. PIRC 04520.
No, I've taken no notes.
Let's go back to the briefing note then, please. And can we look at page 2? And you'll see at the big paragraph it says it was reported. It was reported that as the officers drove into Hayfield Road, they saw the now deceased coming towards them as the vehicles came to a halt. They could clearly see he was in possession of a knife and was making his way towards them. Some of the officers, unknown how many at this stage, drew their police issue batons. At least one of the officers also drew their pava spray and issued a warning to the now deceased, who continued to come forward. Pava was subsequently sprayed towards the now deceased, however this had little effect. There is some reference to him laughing at the officers. It was also reported that one of the female officers was apparently kicked in the back and also sustained a blow to the back of her head. She sustained no serious injury as a result, but complained of pain. You see that?
Yes,
And did you have a copy of this on the morning of the 4th of May?
I did.
I think in your inquiry statement, I won't put this on the screen, you were asked whether Keith Harrower gave out any explanation as to where this information came from. You said that wasn't, and you didn't question it.
That's correct, yes.
To me, you say in paragraph 39 of your inquiry statement, it's a combination of all that information he's getting, trying to put it into a structured and timelessly form. That's his assessment of the information, I would take that as his assessment of the information he was made aware of, but I wouldn't question it. I wouldn't question where did you get that from or where did you get that. So really, did you take that at face value at the time?
Yeah, I did.
And what was your impression? I've been asking other witnesses about this, whether that paragraph gave them the impression that the subject was the aggressor in that situation and the police had responded with baton and sprays. Is that an accurate?
That's inaccurate, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Now, as I understand it, you were that lead investigator for that day on
That's
the 4th of May. And I think we'll hear later that the following day the role was ultimately taken over by John McSporran.
That's correct.
And I think a moment ago you said you understood he was going to support you
Yes.
going forward, but he ultimately became lead investigator.
That's correct.
Thinking about the 4th of May that day, was there anything that you came to know that altered the impression you'd got from that briefing note?
Not at that time, no.
And we've heard from officer that none of the officers gave statements that day, so you wouldn't have had any information from them at that time.
Well, I hadn't given statements the day before. There was no information from the attending officers. Yeah.
And Mr. Harrower gave evidence that neither were there any basic facts,
No.
initial accounts,
No.
or any statements of any description.
No.
Looking back now, how difficult was it for you? We've heard that description isn't entirely in line with the information that became available to PIRC. And I'm wondering, looking back now, how difficult was it for you to move away from that initial impression that you gained from the briefing paper as ultimately more information became available to you?
Well, that's information that Keith had obviously all the kind of meetings he'd been at, so it's like he compiled that into a briefing paper. Having done this many times myself, I understand how he would go about that. Yeah, and as you say, that there is that phrase. They could clearly see he was possession of rifle was making his way towards them. We now know that did not happen. Right. So that was part of the basis of the information. My job, particularly on that first day, was to put in place a structure to allocate roles to people, to ensure everybody knew what that role was, and then look at what priority did we need to do that day. My initial, what did we need to get done that day? Right. Okay, so although that information was there at the time, that wasn't in any way, I didn't take that as being set in stone that what happened, because we had to find out what happened. The whole point is, let's look at the evidence, let's establish what's happened. And having been involved in, I've been involved in investigations since 1980, right? Okay, you work through the evidence, you find the evidence, you work through the evidence, you at times will challenge the evidence, right? Okay, so although that was there, I would say I wasn't taking that as being gospel that had obviously happened. And I would say at the back of my mind, I was always thinking to myself, well, how do we know that? I didn't challenge it, I didn't query it, because I was really focusing on what we really needed to do that day. Okay. And there was pressures on us in respect of the timing of the postmortem, and I felt pressure on myself in respect to the postmortem. Okay, so although that was in there, and I read that, and that obviously gives, that certainly makes a statement that Mr. Bayer was in possession of a knife and making his way towards the officers when they first arrived. We know that's not what happened. Okay, and that's my role, to go to find the evidence and go through that evidence and establish what happened and why it happened.
I'm interested in what you said a moment ago about your job was to put in place a structure that day and allocate a structure so that everyone knew their role and start to prioritise.
Yep.
why was there not a structure already in place that day when you came in?
I don't know. I don't know if the decision, there was obviously a decision made prior to me arriving that I was taking on initially, as I was told, the lead investigator's role in this. Okay, so why was there no structure? There would have been. Keith had some form of structure in the day to deal with it. He'd allocated resources. He'd allocated people to deal with the deceased at the hospital, and that's a structure. He's put that in place, right? When I come in, when I get told, I just immediately, I didn't ask, well, why has nobody done anything about it? Why, right? Who's been allocated to do what, right? So I immediately set about putting in place a structure. And I think, and you may have alluded to it earlier, is in my mind, this was different from any death investigation that came into the organisation before, right? So I put in place a structure that I would say is a structure I've been trained in, a major incident structure, a major incident protocol, right? I created a major incident room. We'd never had one of them. We'd never used that before, right? Previously, and I think of the previous incident dealt with, whether it be death or whether it be criminality or whatever, is you manage that within your team, or you may have got some help from some other teams, you know, for some part of it, right? I need a wee bit of help to do some door-to-door where this incident happened, can you help me, right? That was not happening in this one. This was getting, in my eyes, and I had to get control over this and how we were going to manage this. So I didn't ask why nobody put a structure in. You say Mr. Mitchell wasn't there. My recollection, you know, passes of time, you know.
I may be wrong in that. That's
yeah,
why we've not heard his
maybe I'm wrong,
evidence.
you know. But I remember being told, because I remember thinking to myself, this surely isn't just going to be my team, myself and my two people, right? You know, and I was basically saying, you can use whatever you want. And right away I went, right, I'm putting in a major incident protocol, as I'd describe it. And I was putting that structure in, and I needed to do that with the resources we had, and I needed the resources to know what they were doing for us to get moving, was the way I say it, in particular in respect of the post-mortem, because there was a time of a post-mortem which is quickly fast approaching, because time eats away at you very, very quickly. You know, the time I had discussions with Irene and Keith, the time I tried to put some structure in place, tell them what I'll brief them, tell them what I want to do, there was a bigger briefing, so people had a better understanding of what had happened, because I wasn't alone in just coming in that day and not being, because I'd only been, I think Keith had 6 people, right? You know, so why was there not a structure? I don't know. I don't know whether we're leaving it for me to decide what would happen. That's the way it felt to me, to be honest with you. But I just set about doing it.
So it became your responsibility as lead investigator to set up that structure from the beginning, really, and decide what you wanted to do?
Well, basically, I just decided that. I felt I just went into automatic role of what over the years my training had you know, had set in me to do. Was the way I view that. So yes.
So you're taking control of this investigation,
Yes.
treating it like a major incident, and setting up the structure you think will best serve the interests of the investigation.
To the best of the ability of the resources we had, yes.
And you've said, someone said to you, use who you want. Is that what you said?
No, somebody said just use everybody.
Use everybody.
Yeah.
So how many resources did you have available on that day?
I'm just having a wee look, if you don't mind. I'm just having a wee look at my daybook, and I'm trying to. No, I've not made aware of that. So hold on a second. No. I've not made a note of it on that day. I think in the preceding days I made a note of who was involved, but in that particular day, because it was, so I certainly, I created what I'd call a major incident room to deal with the flow of information coming in, and I placed 3 people within that.
Who were they?
That was Ian McIntyre, who was a fellow DSI. Laura, who's no longer with us. I'm sorry, her surname escapes me. That's dreadful. And I put in one of the administrators, one of our admin staff into that. Excuse me.
And in terms of
So another ones are obviously I allocated John Ferguson and Stuart Taylor to attend the postmortem. I allocated, or there was discussion and there was an allocation of Alistair Lewis and John Clerkin as flows. I then allocated Brian Dodds and I think 4 others in respect of house to house. And I allocated Gary Sinclair and Maurice Rhodes to continue in their role in respect of the scene management and the handover, or dealing with the scenes that were still, because I think we still had control of the scene at Hayfield Road at that time.
so three in the major incident room.
Yep.
Yourself in charge as lead investigator.
Yes.
Ian McIntyre, Laura and
Laura White. Sorry, my
Laura
apologies.
White.
My apologies.
And a member of the admin team were the 3 in the major incident room.
In the
So
incident room, yeah.
you 3 in the incident room. John Ferguson and Stuart Taylor allocated to attend the postmortem.
Yes, they'd been involved in the recovery of Mr. Bayou's remains. Yes.
That had been the previous day.
Previous day, yes.
Alistair Lewis and John Clarkin as flows.
That's correct.
Brian Dodds plus 4
I think it was 4 with Brian to liaise with
house to
Police
house.
Scotland in respect to the house to house and then undertake inquiries in line with the terms of reference we had from the Crown. I also allocated 2 in respect of CCTV, and this is looking at,
Do you know who they were?
it was Kevin Rooney and John Macaulay. And I also allocated 2 to attend the hospital, because we didn't have Mr.
Hospital
Bayou's
records.
hospital records. And
Who were they?
That was Marcus Mitterer, who was my line manager at the time. He was a senior investigator, and Edward Miles, who was a DSI.
Now I was counting, so let me go back
Sorry,
to
my
that.
apologies. So this is
I
off the
think
top of
up
my head
to-
in respect to that, so yeah.
Up to Brian Dodds, I think I counted 10 people.
Right.
Then the 4 that were with Brian Dodds takes us up to 14.
Yeah.
Then Gary Sinclair and Maurice Rhodes, who continued with their scene management role.
Yeah.
That takes us up to 16. 2 for CCTV, Kevin Rooney and John Macaulay, which is 18.
Yep.
And 2 Mitterer and Miles at the hospital. So that's a total of 20 people. That must have been a large percentage of the investigators that you had available.
It was everybody.
Staff.
It was everybody, as I said, apart from Richard Casey. It was everybody.
Right. And Casey was left back in the office, checking being available for
Yeah.
other.
That was my understanding, that Richard wasn't to be utilised in respect of involvement in the investigation.
And so as lead investigator on that day, you've come in on the Monday morning,
Yes.
taken control and essentially allocated 20 people are involved in this investigation.
Yes.
And did you think that was necessary to cover the scope of the investigation at that time?
It was all we had.
Would
And
you
it
have
was
allocated
necessary.
more?
If
you'd
I had more, I would have asked. I later on asked the Commissioner to to give me the review staff. So we shut down the review section.
Right. How many were in the review
I-
section?
I think there would have been about 6 or 7 in there who deal with another aspect of PIRC's.
We've heard about case handling reviews.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
So that was an additional 6 or 7 staff. When did you
Yeah.
get them?
I didn't get them. It was a number of days later I got them, and that was in respect of the size of the house-to-house inquiries that we had to conduct, and that was after we were given the whole incident, as I would describe it, rather than just a bit of the incident, which was we had in the first few days.
Right. Well, we can look at how
Yep.
that expanded. Overall, the Crown Office terms of reference at that time we've heard were given in a telephone conversation between Mr. Green and Mr. Harrower the day
Yep.
before. As I understand it, on the 4th of May, you didn't have anything in writing from
No.
the Crown.
No.
And as I understand it, you didn't get anything in writing until the following day. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So were you working on the same basis as Mr. Harrower had?
Yeah. And I must say, that's not unusual. That's not unusual for an out-of-hours or a weekend event, you know, that we get a verbal instruction that allows us to, because we have to be instructed, the way the legislation is, we have to be instructed. And then that would be followed up by a letter. The challenge maybe being is because the Monday was a public holiday day, maybe a challenge for Crown, I don't know. But yeah, normally the next working day we would receive a written instruction from Crown.
We've heard from Mr. Harrower that the initial approach instructed by the Crown was for PIRC to investigate the events in Hayfield Road and the cause of death, the subsequent cause of death at the hospital. And then the police were to continue to look at events leading up to that.
That was my understanding as well, yes.
That was the position you had on that day.
Yes.
I understand you had some concerns about that approach. I think in your inquiry statement you said you thought it was a...
I'd never came across it before. It was not something I'd encountered in my time in any, you know, that we do a bit, the police do a bit. I'd never encountered that before. I thought it was, I did think to myself, you know, obviously put instruction in place, but your mind's working, you know, 100 mile an hour. What do we need to do? Why do we need to do it? But I remember thinking to myself, but the events that led to Mr. Bayou being in Hayfield Road, he didn't just drop out the sky into Hayfield Road. There is all these precursor events that have a huge bearing on what happened at Hayfield Road, because you had all the members of the public who phoned up regarding an action that led to the police attending that incident. So how was I just to deal with the police engagement with Mr. Bayou and events thereafter? But you had all these precursor events, which in my mind had a huge bearing on where we went to.
Was that going to cause concerns for you as lead investigator, working out where that dividing line was?
If it had continued, I would suggest it would have done, yes. That obviously became resolved on the Tuesday, and quite rightly resolved in my mind. But and this was just, you know, within my own mind, and it was compounded by a phone call I took later on from Mr. Nicholson, and I couldn't disagree with him, you know, in relation to that call.
I'll come on to that later. We've heard evidence about the police when they're investigating an unexplained, unascertained death, that they develop hypotheses, and that a hypothesis, for example, could be that there's an underlying health condition, or it could be that he was assaulted previously and then collapsed as a result of that prior assault in Hayfield Road. Is that the sort of difficulty that you envisage when trying to divide an investigation into two?
Yes, yes, there would be, because I couldn't see at that time, and this was all just going through my head. I recall, you know, in respect of, right, this is what we're going to do, this is what we've been instructed to do, and then as you start move forward that day, you know, I'm thinking to myself, well, I would need to know what the police were doing, and their part of the investigation to inform me of what I would need to take forward once we got it really moving, the investigation, you know, really kind of moving. And I couldn't see how that would be. So the police are doing a wee bit. So I would need to, you know, we don't have the ability, you know, to manage a police investigation. That's not, you know, we investigate part. The police are told to investigate part. How do you get the two to meet? If that is the way it was continued, and how do you ensure you have a transfer of information in a seamless and timelessly manner, you know, to ensure that I'm not taking forward actions that actually they're not informed well enough, because this is what happened beforehand.
And I think you said that was not something you knew PIRC had ever dealt with before.
Not that I'm aware of, and certainly not that I'd been aware of before. Not that I'm aware of.
Have you ever been in that situation with PIRC up until your retiral?
No.
After me?
No.
No. Right. Thank you. I wonder if that might be an appropriate time for break.
We'll have a 20-minute break now. Graham.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 41 of your second inquiry statement, SBPI 00421? And it's paragraph 41. You mentioned here that officers hadn't provided initial accounts, hindering the PIRC investigation. If we can go on to the next page, please. You say, at the start of the investigation, I obviously had no account from any of the officers. It was unclear who had attended and in what order. I had no clarity on what each officer's actions were, and more importantly, why they took those actions. I needed to know what had Mr. Bio's actions been when the first officers encountered him. Two things I'd like to ask you about here. The phrase, more importantly, why they took those actions. Why the reasons why officers had taken actions significant to the investigation?
The first point was obviously, I would say, would be so we had an understanding of what had happened. The officers had attended there in response to a number of calls from members of the public. They'd taken actions, and I think it was important to know why they took those actions. From Keith's briefing and briefing paper, there's an inference that CS and PAV has been used, batons have been used, restraints have been placed. There's been a police officer injured in some manner. I had no idea how that had occurred, in what order it occurred, who did what, the rationale for doing that. Yeah, police officers obviously have quite unique powers in society. They're allowed to use force, but they've got to justify it, and it's got to be proportionate, and it's got to be necessary. So why did that? Why was there that level of force? You know, we have basically all the components in their armoury all used. I don't think there was a taser officer there at that time, you know, but they used CS, they used PAVA, they've used batons, they've used restraints, and they used handcuffs, which we knew later they'd used handcuffs. Why was it necessary for that whole gambit to happen?
Was that something you wanted to know the answers to as part of your investigation?
Yes.
And then you say, I needed to know what had Mr. Bio's actions been when the first officers encountered him. Would that be part of that aspect of your investigation?
Yeah, there was obviously, in my mind, there would have been a rationale why all these aspects took place. You know, it's you know, in my mind, there had to be a reason why this all occurred. You know, why did the police resort to that level of force?
And if, as is noted in the briefing paper, a subject is aggressive and approaching officers with a knife, presumably the response by officers will be seen in a different light than if that person is unarmed and walking past the officers.
Yes.
Can we look at paragraph 41 below that section? It was being mentioned, it was on the screen. It was being mentioned that police officers had used CS and PAVA sprays, as well as making use of baton, handcuffs, other restraints. Why and by whom, that I did not know. Some of the information I'd be able to piece together from material seized from Police Scotland and other sources like copies of airwave messages, incident logs, other witness statements, CCTV, etc. But that all required time and resources. So their failure to provide initial accounts and later statements caused undue difficulties. And was that something you were commencing in your investigation, collating or gathering in airwave messages, logs? You mentioned earlier storm logs, CCTV.
Yep. Yes.
Was that in an attempt to piece together the chronology of events?
Yes, that sort of information would be gathered for any incident that we undertook, any investigation we undertook. We would look to gather all that and piece together a timeline of what happened, you know, in respect that. But as I said, that all takes time. That just doesn't. Police aren't able just to hand us that over that day, the next day. This takes time to get, and even when we have it, we've secured it. I then have to free up resources to examine that information. Okay, so if you take like an airwave message, I would need somebody to sit, to transcribe that, to listen to it, to transcribe that. You know, this is weeks down the line we're getting this information, you know, once we've got it. So it's all very well the time, the challenge being the time it takes police to provide that information to us. We secure it, we log it, and then we have to examine it, and you have to look at it prior to re-examine it. Yeah.
Was it on the 4th of May that you started the ball rolling with gathering in this type of information? Or
That
was it
information,
later?
no, that came the next day as once we received the written confirmation from Crown what we're to investigate. There, we then go through a formal process where we have to serve a letter of notification onto, in this case, Police Scotland, outlining what we've been asked to investigate, what the legislation is we've been asked to investigate, and also highlighting that we require the following information and the legal framework we're using to get that information.
How long does it take to go through that process or that procedure with the getting the written confirmation, preparing the paperwork, and then ultimately recovering things like airwave messages?
It depends how much it is. It depends where in the country it is. You know, like the airwave messages and the incident logs, they sit in a separate police division. They have numerous. If you take it C3, it's known as, you know, where the calls come into. They have a number of control rooms, but just because there's a control room cited, say in Fife, it doesn't mean all calls go to Fife. They're like virtual control rooms, is my understanding of it. So if I call in and I'm in Fife and the next available person to answer that call is actually sitting in Inverness, then that call goes to Inverness and it's recorded into Inverness. And you know, into that system to the call taker, and then that's handled to a police controller. So it all sounds like, oh, we would like airwave messages, we like all this, but it's all dotted about in different parts of Police Scotland.
Could that process be made more efficient, do you think, and faster?
One of the things, just talking in general here, one of the things that I like to do when I am allocated an investigation is no matter where they are in the country, I'll go and see them almost at the outset. I'll go and see who is the lead investigator, the senior investigating officer, the person in charge of that incident. I'll go and see them, and part of it is explain who I am, explain what I've been asked to do. I've maybe just had a verbal instruction at that time. I've maybe received the written instruction, and I'll go and say to them, and I'll say to them, what I'll be looking for from you is the following, and I'll give them a list relative to that. I says, if you were able to have somebody start and gathering that now, I says, because tomorrow I will serve on the Assistant Chief Constable an official letter instructing this. So I like to try and get the ball rolling right at the start because it takes time. Okay, we don't have access to police systems. Okay, if we had access to police systems, it would be great. For example, when I started in PIRC, and I started on the 1st of March, and we were in different offices, we were in temporary office. At that time, we were told that we would get view-only access to one of the police systems, criminal history records, right? And that was part of a safety point of view. If we're going out to see somebody, we'd like to know if there's any warning signals or somebody. Right? I was told we'd have that shortly and be installed at Hamilton. We're still waiting on that system. Okay, we have no access to the police systems. If we had view-only access to the police systems, great, we could go in and view that. Okay.
Would that help investigators?
That would help. That would speed up. Absolutely, it would speed up.
And your practice of speaking to the SIO and giving them advance notice,
Yep.
essentially, of what you're looking for, was that followed by other investigators, or is that something unique to you?
I don't know, something that I did, because also the letter's very formal. The letter's served an assistant chief constable, you know, and then passed down. And I also think it's, I used to always think if I was sitting in my old role when I was in the police, if I was sitting in my last office and I get allocated and I get sent that letter, I'd be like, great, I've still got all my other work to do with, I've got my other, whatever it be, robberies, homicide, whatever I'm dealing with, and I've been asked to deal with this as well. So it's a bit of like having good relations, trying to ensure that you get information quickly. And my viewpoint is, maybe a wee bit old school, go and see somebody face to face, have a coffee with them, explain who we are. Particularly, you know, a lot of people don't know who we are. A lot of people in the police don't know who we are.
Even now?
If they've not been involved with us, right, you know, a lot of people don't know who they are, right? So it's just kind of identifying that and in some way trying to get some way to speed up the information you get and when you get it. You know, because invariably a lot of the information you get it in dribs and drabs as well. And I'll accept it in dribs and drabs. Yeah, we can put a time frame onto police to say, invariably we'll say within 7 working days, which we do. I don't think I've ever had an investigation where within 7 working days I've had all the information I've asked for. And part of the challenge being it's dotted all around the place. And in the way you work through a single point of contact, a SPOC, but they then have to feed out to like C3, to personnel for complaint history records, such like. So all gets fed out.
Thank you. Can we look at paragraph 142, please? I'd like to ask you about some paperwork regarding the use of CS and PAVA sprays. 142. You were asked about the paperwork, including notebooks, use of force forms, CS or PAVA spray forms. And we've heard evidence that it was a legal requirement to, if you discharged your CS spray, that you should complete a form. We've heard that that form was then sent to PIRC through various email addresses. We've also heard evidence about notebooks and such like. I think here in 142, you say the failure to complete documents was known to Police Scotland as they had reported this fact to PIRC. Did PIRC have no power to require officers to complete forms or notebooks?
No, we don't have. No.
And
Well,
once,
not in a Crown-directed investigation.
That's important. I think in a Chief Constable directed
Referral,
investigation, would that be a different answer?
Well, we have the power for them to supply the information to us in a format that we require to. And my understanding of the legislation is there a failure of that, then we could seek recourse through a civil process.
And do you know why there is a difference between a Crown-directed investigation, such as took place on the 3rd of May 2015, and a Chief Constable-directed investigation? We've
No.
heard some evidence about the legislation,
Yes.
B1 and B2
Yes.
and that type of thing. Do you know why there's different powers?
No, I don't. I find it quite ironic that in the police referred investigation, we have more powers. You know, we have the power to go in and enter any police office and search any police office, you know, as long as it's justified, but we have that power under a Chief Constable referred investigation.
But not under Crown-led?
No, in a Crown one I need to seek a warrant.
Right. And in terms of in a Crown-led investigation, a Crown-directed investigation, once Police Scotland report the failure of forms documentation being completed, is that they've satisfied their obligations at that point?
Well, they've told us they haven't completed it, so we're not getting that information.
Yeah.
Now, normally I would say, and this one is in respect of the CS PAVA spray, because that's obviously, as we've discussed previously, that is, you know, in the legislation a firearm, and there's an obligation or there was a legal requirement to notify us about the use of a firearm, the discharge, obviously, is what was happened there. So there is a legal notification. The framework for that happens generally is that information is collated through Officer Safety Department in Police Scotland, in Police Scotland's example, and that's passed to us. Okay, that didn't happen in this case, but when we spoke to the officers, they passed that information to us. They told us they discharged. So we maybe come on to it later on in the investigation. So my viewpoint is I had an action outstanding for the in-gathering of the forms completed, the CS PAVR through the normal framework and there wasn't any submitted. So I took the viewpoint that the officers have told us in their statements they discharged PAVR or CS spray. So they had fulfilled their legal requirement to tell us about it. So why would I then go back to Police Scotland and say, I want you to fill these things in retrospectively? I've got the information, and the legal requirement is they give us that information, and they had done. Certainly, it took a month to get it, but we had it.
So from the 4th of June, when the officers gave their actual statements to
Yeah.
PIRC, they then, during that process, explained they'd discharged their
Yes.
sprays and fulfilled, as far as you were concerned, that requirement.
Yes.
But in the period from the 3rd of May until they gave their statements,
Yep.
there were no forms available
No.
to you, and you had no power to insist on that.
No.
Was there any way you could have insisted on those forms being completed at that time?
No, I couldn't. It'd be up to Police Scotland to consider it as a conduct matter. I couldn't.
And PIRC will presumably you can confirm PIRC wouldn't have any authority to proceed with conduct matters in
No,
relation to police officers.
we only deal with conduct in respect to senior officers, which is Assistant Chief Constables and above.
So for constables or members of the response team, you wouldn't have any authority to put pressure on them by
No.
dealing with conduct matters?
No.
Thinking about the future, is that the type, would it be of assistance to PIRC who are conducting an investigation to be able to put some sort of pressure or have some authority to require these forms to be completed?
Then you're opening up the whole can of worms that PIRC becomes responsible for conduct matters for the federated ranks, for the ranks below Assistant Chief Constable. I do not know what the figures are of how many conduct matters are dealt with by, if we take this instance, Police Scotland, bearing in mind they've got, 18,000 officers. I think it's a whole new kind of can of worms. And what I will say is, this is the only time that we've came across this in respect to police officers. Before that, and since that, you know, this threw up a lot of different conundrums in respect of the officer's stance that was taken. You know, it may well be. I think having the power to demand it and they don't give us it, how do you isolate just that part to all the other conduct matters? I don't know. It's not a decision for me, but I can see great challenges for PIRC and its set up in the moment and having to take that on. But it is a consideration. Yeah.
Did you consider at any time making a formal complaint to Police Scotland about the fact these forms, particularly the CS spray forms, hadn't been completed?
No, I didn't. No.
Looking back now, is that something you think maybe you should have done or not?
It's certainly something that we would know the answer to if we had gone down that route. Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose, you know, we are working a wee bit in hindsight here, you know, yes, but I have to say from my personal point of view, I was focusing on, you know, trying to get the information, move the investigation on, the aspect round about the officer's stance and the rationale behind that, and the to and the fro and going on, that actually been kind of taken away from myself and the main and John McSporn, and it was being dealt with by John Mitchell and the Commissioner, and they were engaging with with the officers' legal representatives and the Federation.
We can maybe ask them
Yeah,
evidence.
that
in the
point of view,
future.
but I did not request that Police Scotland consider some form of stance there in respect to the conduct regulations.
And were you aware, we've heard evidence that the officers did not wish to complete any of these documents, including statements at that time, because they wished to take legal advice. Were you aware of that on the 4th of May?
Yeah, I was, yeah. Keith Harrow briefed me on that, yeah.
Can I ask you, if you know the answer to this, what do PIRC actually do when they get use of spray forms into the office? Are they analysed? Are they audited? Are they?
They're analysed. The circumstances and for the use and the rest, they are examined. We have a small, as part of people's duties, to look at the CS and PAVA forums and to examine them and consider if the use of it was justified, proportionate, necessary. They look at all that. A lot of times we will ask for further information from Police Scotland. We may ask for a statement from somebody to that effect. And on some occasions we have taken on investigations. We have moved that to an investigation to ensure that its use is proportionate. There has been a number of criminal investigations undertaken because we have looked at the circumstances. We have not been happy in the circumstances. It appears to show criminality on the part of the police officers, and we have engaged with the Crown in respect of that, and Crown have then instructed us to undertake, and they serve us with notice to undertake in respect of, B1 investigation. So they are not just come in, they don't just come in and form a statistical return. That they are examined and looked at, and there's a process for doing that.
Are they examined in relation to ethnicity?
I don't know.
And can I ask you now to look at SBPI 00255 and paragraph 35, please. And I think you were asked about, we've talked about the inaccuracies that appeared in the briefing note.
Yes.
And you'd asked about your experience as an investigator and how much these early inaccuracies caused detrimental effect to the investigation. And I think I would say you're aware you're getting this, the same kind of information you're receiving over the telephone from different people, briefings of what they know at the time and what they're aware has happened. I use the phrase at PIRC, and I've used it since we started here in PIRC. We're the hindsight brigade. We come in after everything's happened and then try to piece together what actually did happen. Depending what we've been asked to do, we consider it. Is it procedurally correct? Is it accurate? Could there have been recommendations made about certain circumstances? What police did report findings for the Crown. You base your initial decisions on what we're going to do and what we've got, based on the information that's been passed to us at the time. At that time that Keith was getting phone calls, I believe that he was not aware that the police officers were refusing to provide statements. A month after that initial account that Keith got, this is Keith Harrower, as I understand it, that you're referring to.
Yes.
We knew that it contained inaccurate information, but the inaccuracies only came to light when we start piecing everything together and we get the officers' accounts. So it was only after the 4th of June, when officers provided statements, that you realised that there were inaccuracies in the initial accounts that Keith Harrower had been provided.
No, I mean, no. My recollection is no. They obviously gave us a kind of fuller picture of what happened in respect to that. For instance, the briefing paper talks he was clearly in possession of a knife. I can't remember the exact phrase it talks about that. We knew prior to that that would appear to be inaccurate, because the knife was recovered, and it was recovered some distance away from where the police first engaged with Mr. Bow. Right. So the statement was he was clearly in possession of a knife. That's inaccurate.
When did you become aware that the knife was found some distance away from where Mr. Bio was?
I'd have been in the first few days. What day? I can't. I couldn't tell you whether it was. I don't know if it was on the Monday, you know, but I would be surprised if I wasn't aware of that by the kind of Tuesday or Wednesday. That's for sure.
So Keith Harrow is there on the Sunday.
Yes.
You're there on the Monday.
That's correct.
And you think it may have been the Tuesday that you realised that information was incorrect?
Yeah.
When on the Tuesday did you realise? Was it the Tuesday that you were advised about the knife having been found some distance away?
I think it would have been. I would have been aware of that on the Tuesday, at some point the Tuesday. Yeah, because we have a knife recovered. But obviously there was inquiries ongoing to establish if that could have been the knife that the witnesses had seen Mr. Bow carrying. But yeah. And
being aware of that on the Tuesday, was anything done in relation to documentation that was prepared or subsequent briefings that were given to indicate that the information in that original briefing note was incorrect?
Well, the only thing is in relation to the information would have been passed at the briefing that there was a knife recovered and where it was recovered, so that everybody working on the investigation would have been aware of that. That is not information that would have been hidden from any investigators or anybody working on the investigation, so they're aware of that's happening.
We've heard about, well, you were lead investigator on the 4th, but
Yes.
didn't find out about it till the 5th.
I think it would be the 5th, because of the nature of what happened in the 4th, if we go into the postmortem and such like. So
We've heard that about something called cascading, where information is shared.
yes,
And we've heard evidence from Mr. Harrower that information was shared with other investigators on the basis of the 3rd of May briefing.
yeah.
I'm wondering to what extent it would be cascaded to investigators that the knife was found some distance away and Mr. Bio wasn't likely to have been in possession of it. Was that something that
Well,
you
that would have been part of the briefing. Yes, you know, as when we became aware of that. Yeah.
And when would that briefing, that altered briefing, have been implemented?
Well, we briefed every day.
Right.
Okay, I set in place a structure that we briefed every day. You know, and that was important for John and I. You know, to understand what had happened, what the investigators uncovered the day before, and what we were looking for them to focus on the next day and what they were doing. Yeah, so I needed the investigators to tell me what had occurred, to take a statement of somebody and what, you know, roughly what that person had said, rather than waiting to read that statement and catch up on the reading and such like. So, but exactly when that information, but it would have been information passed in a briefing that the knife was recovered some distance away from where the police first engaged with Mr. Bio. Yes.
Right. And when was that information made available to PIRC, that a knife had been found some distance away?
After this passage of time, I can't recall that.
I don't remember. Can you check that document for me? Let's look at paragraph. Oh, sorry. It's on the screen. You say, I have been asked whether I feel that the early hours of the PIRC investigation were hampered by the failure of the officers to give those initial accounts. Absolutely yes. I would be more wary now after what happened, but up to that point, I would be making an assumption, which was wrong, that this information is coming from the people who were actually at the incident. If we can move down the page, please. If I'm past some information, I would have it in the back of my mind. Is this actually coming from the people, or is this just all this mishmash of what's happened flying about, rather than the people who were actually there telling us what happened? I'd go back to basic facts, initial accounts. So when you were given the briefing on the morning of the 4th of May, now you would be more wary about making an assumption, but is it correct that you assumed that the information you were given on that date was correct?
Yes. And just to be, clear, my recollection is the briefing on the 4th of May was provided by Keith
Yes.
and Irene. I then allocated during the course of that briefing roles that people to take. So I didn't brief on the briefing paper. It was Keith, he'd obviously been there on the 3rd, so he kind of imparted that information to the team.
Yeah, I think you said earlier you had no idea what had happened when you arrived at the office.
No.
You did become aware of the briefing note, the briefing paper, at
Yes.
some point on the 4th.
Yes.
Can we have a look at that again, please? It's PIRC 03694. So I think I'd quite like to look at page 3, please. Now, I think at this stage, when we look at the briefing note, there was some information that a knife had been found. Under subsequent police action, COPFS, it says, in response to the circumstances, Police Scotland secured the location. At some stage, officers removed the knife, believed to be in possession of now deceased, from the ground at Locus, along with 3 police-issued batons. So I think, at least in this briefing note, it appears that although it was recognised a knife had been found at the Locus, that it says believed to be in possession of now deceased. So there was no distinction made in the briefing note at that time that perhaps it was found some distance away.
No, it just says at Locus, and it was a very big scene.
Yeah. And would this be indicative of the fact that you didn't have statements from the officers, so you didn't know exactly what had taken place? Or was it an indication that they hadn't collated CCTV evidence or witness statements to allow an assessment of that kind to be made?
I think it's a mixture, and at that time we didn't have, we didn't have the statement from the officer that recovered the knife, and that would obviously have given an indication of exact recovery point.
We've heard that was a DC O'Connell that recovered the knife. You didn't have a statement from him at that point?
Well, I don't think I had a statement. I wasn't aware of, that time. It would also be, we'll have a record of when we got that statement. But
yes, I can check that. Thank you. Can I ask you for your views on? We've heard some critical comments. Let's look first of all. It's SBPI 00255, paragraph 37, please. Now, I think this asks you about your recollection. You were told there was a death in custody of a male in Kirkcaldy, and you say it was really high profile. There's already lots of media attention surrounding it. I was to be lead investigator. Was it clear to you from the very outset of your appointment that this was going to be a very high profile incident with media attention?
that was the feeling I had, and I think as I explained earlier, that's why I immediately put in place, or tried to put in place to the best of our capacity and ability, as a major incident structure.
We've heard evidence previously that an officer said he knew that there was going to be a lot of media attention because a man had died, it was after contact with the police, and that man was black. Would you agree with that assessment? That would promote significant media attention?
Yes, I would. If I think of the amount of deaths in custody we've had, unfortunately we've had a few, that's a fact. Right. There has not been the level of media attention attached to any of those investigations compared to this investigation and the circumstances of it.
What was it that elevated the media attention in this situation, in your view? What factor?
Well, there was a number of factors as we moved on. you know, a number of factors. You know, I'll go back to the stance of the police officers and the legal advice they took. That obviously compounded what happened. The media became aware of that, and lots of questions were being asked round about that. Yeah. From my point of view, I was just trying to focus on what do we need to do, how do we keep moving forward, you know, in gathering the evidence, assessing the information, examining that evidence, and looking at the facts. You know, so yeah. But the 3 points that you made is yes, that's what generated. There was media attention. You know, and you could see that just by the news on that day. My recollection, articles appearing in the paper. You know.
I'm grateful for my learned junior checking. It would appear that O'Connell's statement was dated the 4th of May. This is the officer who recovered the knife. It commenced at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 1300 hours.
Okay.
How long would it take for the information that was gathered in from that statement to then reach your ears?
I would say it would. Although that information, he completed that statement obviously that day, and he highlighted that. I don't recall getting that information on the 4th. That's a certainty. The information was all put into the police home system, right? These statements, they recorded that. It took us a significant amount of time to get all the information from Police Scotland over. So what time that statement was actually, when and what date that statement was passed to us, is I don't know, but I know we were many days down the line when we were still having to get information from Police Scotland. And that's more, I know it talks about handover, and I'm quite sure you'll move on to that, but it's not like we go into the office and say thanks very much, we'll just take everything away. It is staged, you know, from that point of view. So I cannot tell you sitting here now when I became aware of that information, okay? But what I will say is I knew that information before the officers were interviewed. That's an absolute certainty.
Thank you. We've heard some evidence from Pat Campbell about comments he's made about the change in lead investigator. And we've heard that Keith Harrower was lead investigator on the Sunday. You were brought in on the Monday and took on that role. And then there's evidence available to the chair by way of written statement from John McSporran that he then took over the following day. Yes. Now, it would appear that is 3 lead investigators over the course of 3 days. Okay. And Pat Campbell, who gave evidence, talks about this and talks about the challenge that would present. Obviously, he's coming at it from the perspective of a senior investigating officer in charge of an investigation for the police. But he comments on the issues with that transfer, 3 lead investigators over 3 days. I mean, how common is it in PIRC to have 3 lead investigators in 3 days?
I think the 3 is uncommon. That's uncommon, yes. But obviously the continuity is John and I remaining in place for this investigation. So I know you're saying it's 3 initially. You know, it's passed to me. The brief I got was be lead investigator John McSporran will provide oversight. I think by the time we got to the 5th, it was obvious that, you know, we needed to provide a kind of a structure, because in effect I had no deputy. So I became John's deputy. John came in. So there's a continuity of those. The point that Mr. Campbell makes is the passing of the information between Keith and myself and the changeover. I didn't make that decision, somebody else made that decision. All I can say is that in my experience it occurs, and if you take from if I talk firstly about the PIRC point of view, is we have an on-call team. We have a DSI leads the on-call team. The on-call team is a week on-call. It's a Friday to Friday, okay? So if Keith had been appointed as the lead investigator, yeah, who was going to then take over Keith's role of being on call from the Monday to the following Friday? Yeah, so I'd imagine that would have been one of the considerations. So I have been on call with PIRC. I have attended the scene of an incident out of hours, and I have passed over to somebody else because I've been told, you're not leading this, somebody else is leading this. In my role in the police, when I was a DI in the police, and I would be covering on call for Glasgow City Centre, is I have encountered the same scenario. I have dealt with an incident. I remember I dealt with an incident where there was a death of a child. There was lots of issues with the death of the child. The family were deaf, so I had to bring in interpreters and manage all that. The death occurred in the hospital, so you're having to manage the scene at the hospital. I handed that over to somebody else on the Monday. I dealt with it occurred on the Friday. I dealt with Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I handed that over to. I was instructed to hand that over to somebody else. So it occurs. Is it ideal? I can understand the consideration why it's not ideal, but the practicalities of sometimes is that can't happen. You know, and I also think Keith was also going on holiday soon. You know, so do you run Keith into the investigation and then he goes away on holiday, and it runs without a deputy for whatever long Keith's on holiday for? I don't know. I would suggest that is a question that the person who made the decision that I take over on the Monday would be better placed to answer. But what I would just give you is the practicalities that I've encountered.
Can I ask you, we've heard that on the 5th of May, a senior investigator, John McSporran, was
Yes.
brought in, and you've said you were a deputy senior investigator. You continued to work to John McSporran from that date.
Yes.
We've also heard that Casey was a senior investigator.
Yes.
He was available in the office on the Sunday. He
Yes.
was available in the office on the Monday.
Yes.
I'm wondering, do you know why senior investigator Casey couldn't have taken the role of lead investigator from the outset?
That's not a question I can answer.
All right. We can ask someone else.
Thank you.
You talked earlier today about your priorities, and I wonder if you could look at your notebook, please. So you come in as lead investigator and you're working out your priorities. I think there's notes in PIRC 04200.
04200.
You might find it helpful to have the hard copy in front of you. And I'd like to go through some of the entries that you made. So I think if we start on what is my page 2, it's the sort of first official book page of the notebook. There we are. And we can see on the left-hand column, Monday, 4th of May, 2015, 7:50 hours, and it says reported on duty, I think. Appointed as lead investigator. Do you see that at the bottom?
Yes, I
on the
have.
left?
Yes, got that. Yeah.
And I wonder if you can read out the right-hand column at the top. It says to a death of, is that male? Believed to be Shekubayo?
Yeah, right, sorry, I was at the wrong bit for it. Yeah, so I'm reading that. So, investigation to death of male believed to be Sheku Bayu. Was obviously an address in Kirkcaldy. Died on the 3rd of May 2015, Kirkcaldy Victoria Hospital after being arrested. Briefing given by SI Casey and DSI Harrower. Major incident protocols instigated. And then I've got priority actions that I've underlined.
And can you read out the priority actions, please?
Postmortem, family need to be contacted. That's... I am struggling on right. And engage with engagement with postmortem or PM. I've got PM. Door-to-door inquiries, establish MIR, scene management. That's the
What's established MIR?
major incident room.
Scene management, and then on to the next page.
Yeah.
What does it say?
Terms of reference. There's a legislation, section 33A, Police Public Order and Criminal Justice Scotland Act 2006 to investigate interaction between the police and the deceased and the events thereafter.
And then the next entry is 1235. We'll
Yeah.
come on to that in a moment.
Okay.
So is this the only entry in your notebook that relates to your initial priorities?
Yeah, I would say so.
Is there anything in your daybook about your priorities that we should
Sorry, I
be
need to
aware
check
of
that.
as well?
4520.
I mean, I think on what I have, this is PIRC 04520,
Yes.
which we can have on the screen, and it's page 2 of the PDF.
Yep.
And we can see, if we move down the page towards the bottom, we see an entry, Monday the 4th of May 2015. And I think it says 7:50 reported on duty, perhaps. There's a
Yep.
mark over it.
Yeah.
And then advisory death in custody. I can't read the next
Well,
line.
it's op COIC. We give every investigation we do an operational name. So this was given Operation
Oh, I
Operation
see.
COIC.
I see. And then on to page 3, from initial briefing. I don't know what the next word says.
From initial briefing paper, deceased Sheku Bayou 31 resides at, and it's been redacted, I think, is it? Yeah.
And so
And
you
then-
seem to have had the initial briefing paper. Would that be the briefing note we've looked at earlier?
Yeah, it would appear to be I have had access to that briefing paper, and I apologise when you asked me earlier in respect to that. I actually looked at the 5th and the 4th, and it was only when we moved on I realised it. So I've obviously had that, and then I've taken notes regarding morning briefing.
Now, is this morning briefing, does it say 9:30 in the morning on 3, and then it says 3 May 2015?
Yeah, this is basically Keith. So I've got more. So this is Keith highlighting the information he received.
Right.
So I've got 9:30, and then I've put up the 3rd or the 5th. KH, Keith Harrier, got telephone call from Dave Green re-instant. KH lays with Gary Blackhall and Pat Campbell. Yeah, so I would suggest what's happening here is I've just made some scribbly notes here while there's a briefing ongoing. Yeah.
And you mentioned members of the public,
Yeah.
medical staff, and
Yeah.
you mentioned the flows that you
Yeah.
told us you appointed. It says Muslim, does
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
So you were aware from an early stage he was Muslim. And then it says Chief Inspector Cultural Issues by
Police Scotland.
Police Scotland.
Yeah.
And then Kevin Hoolison. You've scored that out. Stuart Hoolison. What was that in relation to?
Well, I've also got flow contact as my understanding. I've obviously by that time Alistair Lewis and John Clerkin are going to be our designated flows. And I've made a wee note here that, because my understanding is Kevin Hoolison was identified and minuted that he would be the family liaison officer. And I'm looking at that for flow contact. Who would my flows contact to speak to? Now I realise that Kevin Hoolison was not deployed, and you may go on to that later. But that's initially I'm thinking who of my family liaison team, who can they speak to engage with the family? Because in our circumstances where Police Scotland have deployed flows and then we deploy flows, the normal process would be I would have my flows engage with the Police Scotland flows and have the Police Scotland flows introduce the PIRC flows, and thereafter they would then be responsible for engagement with the family.
So that was identified as a priority for you on that
Well,
day.
look, yeah, because I need to engage with. We need to have some engagement with the family. Yeah, absolutely.
And then moving on to the next page, again it refers to flows. What does it mean 0105 there? You
Don't
see a
know.
number in the top right hand? No.
I have no idea why I've scribbled that down. What it refers to.
And then you seem to have 5 items numbered down the left hand column.
Yeah.
and it's headed up flows. What's number 1? Postmortem?
Postmortem, family need to know about postmortem.
Right.
Okay, that's...
So that was your number 1
I mean-
import.
Yeah, I would say that on that day I would say it was. I wouldn't say these are all written in particular order. I'm not sitting structurally thinking that we need to do that first, that, second. These are things we need to do.
Are these things that you're hearing from the briefing, or are these things that you're noting as your priorities?
I think it's things because I'm hearing from the briefing, I'm having to think about what needs to happen. Yeah,
And then 2 is door to door,
yeah, and it's Brian, it's opposite, it's Brian Dodds I'm talking about. Or Brian Dodds, sorry.
and 3 is Laura. You
Laura
mentioned
White that I
her.
talked about, clues, so that's obviously the information management system would be within our instant room.
And then 4 is CSM, crime scene management, with
Yeah.
Gary.
/ Fergie and Stuart, and I've circled
John
Fergie and
Ferguson.
Stuart. Yes.
And,
Yes, sorry, John Ferguson.
and Stuart Taylor, I think you
Yes.
said. And then 5, I don't see it, it's something
No,
separate.
I don't.
it's
I've obviously done
redacted.
something's happened, and then I've been made aware that
So-
as part of the post-mortem process, prior to the post-mortem, the deceased remains are going to be examined by Quasar.
What? Let's look at the post-mortem. Family need to know about post-mortem.
Yeah.
What steps did you take, having identified that as one of your priorities that morning? What steps did you take to fulfil that priority?
So I was aware that the family had been there'd been engagement with the family regarding the post-mortem process. I think my recollection is like there had been engagement by one of the senior police officers about that. Keith Harrower had also engaged with the family that evening, and my understanding was matters about the post-mortem, because there'd been a decision that the post-mortem was going to be held on the Monday. And in my experience, the family will, or a very close family friend, but normally the family will, part of the postmortem, before the postmortem can commence, is the remains have to be identified. Okay, so the family, that would normally be a part of the family. So I had, and I was aware that there had been, the family had asked that the postmortem not take place. I think, I don't know if I'm getting events right, but whether I knew at that time that the family were unable to, or say they're unable or unwilling to, but the family, when there was a reluctance in the family to come and identify the body on the Monday, because they were waiting on other family members arriving. I'm quite certain I knew that at that time.
Who told you that?
Well, that must have been Keith, or yeah, it must have been Keith. I was aware of that. Okay, and I knew the post-mortem was scheduled for that morning. Right. So, because we've identified flows, right, but I didn't want the flows calling the family directly when they've had no introduction. They don't know our. Somebody just phoning up and say, "Hi, I'm Alistair Lewis. I'm from the police investigator. I'm your flow." That's not applicable. So I asked Keith, because he'd met with the family and he knew who he was, to phone the family, and it was I can't remember if it was Mr. Johnson at the time identified or his wife identified as a family, to phone them and basically say, "Look, this." My understanding is the post-mortem's taking place. Crown's decided this post-mortem's taking place. We have family liaison officers now in place. Part of the process is the body needs identified. Will you engage with us in respect of that? Because if they'd said yes, I would have then immediately dispatched my family liaison officers to meet with the family and brief them as to what would happen at the post-mortem and what's to be expected when they go to identify the body. Because how many people have actually undertaken that role? So it's important, and be able to support the family and provide advice to the family and taking them forward. Keith did that, and that's what did that. And I also asked him at that time to introduce Alistair Lewis as the lead flow during that phone call.
So was it an instruction from you as lead investigator to Keith Harrower?
Yeah.
To speak to the family?
Yeah, I did not want Alistair Lewis phoning the family I'm going to say a cold call, because they didn't know who he was. And suddenly, and that would be wholly and totally inappropriate. Okay.
And who told you that Crown Office had decided the post-mortem should take place?
At that time, Keith.
Thinking back, was your impression that in relation to the Crown Office decision, that had been made and it was taking place regardless?
I don't know about the word regardless, but it was certainly that it was taken, the Crown had made the decision for whatever reason that it was taking place. But following Keith's conversation with the family, I contacted Dave Green and I outlined the family's position in respect of the post-mortem.
What did you say to Dave Green?
Well, I haven't. I've having a wee quick flick through there. I haven't recorded it.
Well, let's look at SBPI. This may assist you. 00255. Paragraph 40. I'm asked about the section in my statement which states, I was further advised that during the events on 3rd May, the immediate family had intimated to Harrower that they did not wish the post-mortem process to proceed at this stage and asked that it be deferred until relatives and elders attended from England. The family could not give a date or time of arrival of such persons. This had been passed to Crown Office, but instructions had been given that the post-mortem would be taking place. The family intimated that they would not be engaging in this process. I have been asked whether I have ever dealt with a request from a family regarding the timing of a post-mortem for religious or other reasons. My recollection is no, I haven't. I have been asked what I did with this request. I did have a discussion with Crown, David Green, about it in this instance. Keith had had some interaction with the family the night before, although I was appointing 2 family liaison officers to deal with the family. But Keith had met the family, so I asked him to phone again and to engage with us and ask them again to engage with us in the post-mortem process. So although Keith had told me they didn't want to be involved in the process, I asked Keith to contact the family because they knew who he was. While Flo's had been appointed, they had never met the families. What I got back from Keith was, no, they're not engaging. They don't want the post-mortem to go ahead. I phoned David Green at Crown about that. I'll move on to the David Green thing in a moment. When you say what you got back from Keith, so this is after you've instructed him to contact the family. Yes. The phrase there is, no, they're not engaging, they don't want the post-mortem to go ahead. That's in quotation marks. Is that your recollection of what Keith said to you?
Yes, I mean, that's my first statement to the public inquiry, isn't it? The statement I gave a year ago.
Yes, that is your first statement.
Yeah, that's my recollection in respect of.
Was there anything said, thinking back now, about the mother travelling up from England, or when she was likely to arrive, or had she already arrived, or anything of that sort?
My recollection is no. At this point in time, I am aware of that conversation took place, yeah. But my recollection of that morning on the 4th of May, I cannot recall being made aware that the family were travelling that day.
Right. And you say then, I phoned David Green at Crown about that, and David told me that the post-mortem was going ahead. I haven't recorded it anywhere, but my recollection is his words were, we need to know how this man died. And again, that's in quotation marks. So I can only ask Crown, I can only impart to Crown the information. It's Crown's decision to hold a post-mortem. And when that post-mortem takes place, and who undertakes the post-mortem, it's not my decision. David Green wasn't willing to delay it, the post-mortem. I had no further information as to his reasoning on that. I passed on to Mr. Green the position of the family because it presents a challenge if family are not attending, because you need a family member or somebody very close to the deceased, because there's an identification process to take place before the post-mortem is undertaken. I'm interested, you understood initially that the family wanted the mother to attend.
Yes.
You have a conversation with Keith Harrower after
Yes.
you've instructed him to speak to the family that morning. And if we can have your quotation on the screen, perhaps, if we can go back up. And what you've recorded there in your inquiry statement is, no, they're not engaging. They don't want the post-mortem to go ahead.
Yes.
Did you, your impression now, did you see that as a change of position from the family, or a sort of hardening of their attitude towards the post-mortem? Because there's no mention there of the mother waiting until the mother arrives.
What that is in my recollection, as Crown's decided the post-mortem's going ahead, right? That decision had been made in the 3rd. When I came on in the 4th, and I was aware there was a post-mortem taking place that morning, and there had been an indication from the family that they were not at that time prepared to attend for identification at that time, due to wishing family members to attend. Yeah. So I tried to overcome that by getting Keith to phone the family again. Maybe they'd thought that with discussion about it. Okay. I wouldn't view that as a hardening of position. The position was they weren't attending. All I've said, no, they're not engaging, they don't want to post it. The rationale why had been imparted previously. So I don't view it as a hardening of position. I phoned Dave Green again to advise him of the family's position. And that's all I can do. All I can do is advise Dave Green, look, the family are unwilling at this to attend for the time you've scheduled this post-mortem. Yeah. Now, his viewpoint was that the post-mortem's going ahead. Now, that presents a number of challenges. First of all, in relation to the post-mortem process, it presents the challenge as, how do we identify Mr. Byers' remains? Because you can't have a post-mortem unless, my understanding is, you can't have a post-mortem remains. So we then have to find an avenue of how we identify that body. You then have the other part, which impacted again, is the relationship with the family. Because the family have made a request. Not unreasonable when you look at it in fullness, absolutely not unreasonable. And we're going ahead and doing the post-mortem. Now, the family have had no contact with Crown at that time. It's not a police process, it's not a PIRC process, it's a Crown process. And the Crown have said, no, it's going ahead. Now, their rationale why, that's something that will obviously be explored. But, as I said, this presented challenges, and I tried to alleviate that by having Keith phone again. Right? Let's see what we can do. And what I've articulated there, yes, I've not articulated what the family's wishes there were, and I've certainly phoned Dave Green. I've obviously articulated to him that about something, because I've then put, and David told me the post-mortem was going ahead. So, you know, there's and then we have to look at how do we then identify the body. Now, that's their decision, but I have to let them know we have nobody to identify this body. But vice versa, going forward, as we have created some conflict, or I'm going to say conflict with the family that we didn't need to, that we absolutely didn't need to, right? Because a post-mortem is, you know, as you know, is it's a very, very invasive process, and families need to be aware of what happens there. And my family liaison officers could have assisted to alleviate a lot of these issues. Right? You know, if the post-mortem had been delayed, then I could have my family liaison officers meeting with the family, engaging with the family, trying to explain to them, or explaining to them in a controlled, calm environment about what's going to happen here. You know, but the post-mortem just went ahead. Okay.
Are you satisfied now in terms of your recollection that you explained the family's position to David Green that they didn't want to attend until the mother had arrived from London or England?
I believe I would have done that. I can't see, you know, I would have explained, I would have just said they're not prepared to attend to identify the body. Because that was not the position of the family. Yeah.
So you wouldn't have said that because that
I
wasn't
can't,
your
yeah,
understanding?
I would explain, because the whole point of getting Keith to phone them again was to re-engage with the family.
And are you satisfied from your recollection now that David Green understood the family position? That they wanted to wait until the mother had arrived?
I don't know what David Green understood. That's something I think that David Green needs to be asked.
We'll should hear evidence from him in
From
due
my point of
course.
view, is the police have engaged with the family. The family have given an understandable viewpoint why they wanted. I'm not saying they don't want the postmortem to go ahead. They want it delayed. Keith engaged with the family. I asked Keith to re-engage with the family. That has all been imparted to Crown.
Right.
Okay, but it's a Crown process.
From what you've said, would your preference have been for the post-mortem to have been delayed?
I understand the rationale as we needed to identify as soon as possible the cause of death. I understand the rationale for that. But to balance that against the family's wishes and the reason they gave, sitting here now, the postmortem should have been on the Tuesday. Sitting here now.
Would it have hindered your investigation in any way if the post-mortem had taken place the next day?
No. No.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. Would that be an appropriate point to break?
Yes, we'll stop for lunch and sit at 2 o'clock.